President Trump snubs Zelensky meeting at G7 summit.
U.S. President Donald Trump stirred public controversy after refusing to attend a scheduled bilateral meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the sidelines of the G7 summit held in Canada on June 17th. According to diplomatic sources, the meeting had been pre-arranged to discuss military aid, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and broader security cooperation. However, at the last minute, President Trump abruptly cancelled the engagement without offering an official explanation. The absence came as a major blow to President Zelensky, who has been actively seeking increased support from Western allies amid intensified Russian attacks in eastern Ukraine. White House officials later explained that President Trump had to leave the summit early to address an urgent situation in the Middle East, specifically rising military tensions between Israel and Iran. Trump departed Canada later that day without attending any of the planned bilateral meetings. A Trump administration spokesperson stated, "The president remains fully committed to supporting Ukraine, but his top priority at the moment is ensuring national security for the United States and its allies in the Middle East." The move was immediately met with criticism from several bipartisan members of the U.S. Congress, who argued that it signaled the Trump administration's growing neglect of America's global leadership role. They warned that the decision risked making Ukraine feel abandoned during a critical and sensitive period in the war. Despite the absence of a meeting with President Trump, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky continued to hold one-on-one talks with leaders from the UK, France, Germany, and Japan at the G7 summit. In these meetings, he repeatedly emphasized the urgent need to expand military aid to counter intensifying Russian attacks. Earlier, White House officials had confirmed that President Donald Trump was scheduled to hold a bilateral meeting with President Zelensky on June 17th on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, Canada. This would have marked the third in-person meeting between the two leaders since Trump returned to the White House. However, it was also set against a backdrop of escalating conflict and growing doubts about Washington's long-term commitment to Ukraine. President Trump's sudden decision to leave the G7 summit, announced to fellow leaders just hours before his scheduled meeting with President Zelensky, effectively nullified the main goal of a special session on Ukraine. The session had been designed to win Trump's backing in pressuring Russian President Vladimir Putin to agree to a ceasefire. Trump's early departure not only prevented a face-to-face discussion with Zelensky, but also raised serious questions about Ukraine's significance in Washington's strategic agenda. Adding to Kiev's diplomatic setback, the United States vetoed a joint G7 statement on Ukraine, citing concerns that the draft was too anti-Russian and could jeopardize ongoing negotiations with Moscow. Instead, key language on the war was relegated to a chairman's statement by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Some Ukrainian officials have since expressed uncertainty about whether President Zelensky should attend the upcoming NATO summit in The Hague, as President Trump's presence remains unconfirmed. One official remarked, "This is the persistent danger of Ukraine becoming a victim of global events and President Trump's short attention span." President Zelensky had viewed the G7 as one of two golden opportunities to apply unified Western pressure on the Trump administration and to discuss a $30 to $50 billion arms procurement plan from the U.S. as a form of security assurance. Ukraine even proposed purchasing American-made weapons, including modern air defense systems, to counter Trump's criticism that Ukraine is a burden on the U.S. budget. While there have been signals that the U.S. is open to selling weapons to Ukraine, Trump, who held a phone call with President Putin earlier this week, has repeatedly argued that arming Ukraine could prolong a war he has pledged to bring to an end. G7 member states faced difficulties reaching a unified stance on the war in Ukraine after U.S. President Donald Trump expressed support for Russian President Vladimir Putin and departed the summit a day early. A Canadian official told the media that Canada had to cancel plans for a strong joint statement on Ukraine due to opposition from the US. Instead, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a new military aid package worth 2 billion CAD, approximately $1.47 billion US dollars, along with additional financial sanctions against Russia. On his personal Telegram channel, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he warned G7 leaders that diplomacy is in crisis and urged them to keep pressuring President Trump to use his real influence to help end the war. Although Canada remains one of Ukraine's most steadfast allies, its support capacity is not comparable to that of the US, Kiev's largest weapons supplier. Zelensky had hoped to meet with Trump to discuss further arms purchases, but the meeting never materialized. As the summit concluded, Prime Minister Carney released a summary of discussions in his role as chair. It stated that G7 leaders support President Trump's efforts to achieve a just and lasting peace for Ukraine.